Hello, and thanks for stopping by. There are currently over 190 underground railways in operation around the globe, and whatever name each one goes by, whether it be metro, subway, or rapid transit system, it's almost impossible to imagine the great metropolises of the world functioning without them. Out of all of these networks though, the granddaddy of them all, by quite a considerable margin, is the London Underground. Or to be more specific, a certain section of the London Underground running between Paddington and Farringdon, which first opened as the Metropolitan Railway way back in January 1863. Now standing at an impressive 160 years old, this stretch of line is still going strong. And so to honour its recent landmark birthday, I'd now like to take you on a journey through its early history. There's a lot to cover here, as you can probably imagine, and as such, this is going to be a two-part series. So with that in mind, if you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, then I'd really appreciate it if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out on the next instalment. Anyway, on that note, we'll begin now by looking at the origins of the Metropolitan Railway. Whose idea was it? How did it come together? And what was involved in the strenuous task of building it? In the 19th century, London was the world's largest metropolis, a city to which millions of people, pushed by the harsh, grinding realities of the Industrial Revolution, were drawn in search of work. As the population soared, so too did the levels of traffic, and by the 1840s, the capital's muddy, unpaved roads languished in a gridlocked mess, jam-packed with carts, cabs and omnibuses, all of which of course were horse-drawn in those days. A solution was desperately needed, and this is where a gentleman named Charles Pearson comes in. Charles Pearson was born in 1793, which is quite remarkable considering the technology he later proposed, at number 25 St Clement's Lane, right in the heart of the City of London. Charles was a very forward-looking fellow. In his early 20s, he qualified as a solicitor, and he'd later go on to campaign for prison reform and universal suffrage, along with speaking out against corruption within the legal profession. He also took a keen interest in matters of transport, and in 1845 this led him to publish a pamphlet in which he suggested congestion in the capital could be tackled by taking things underground. Charles's initial idea was to build an atmospheric railway, in other words one powered by air pressure, which would have run in what he called a glass envelope along the Fleet Valley between King's Cross and Blackfriars. Although this idea resembles nothing we see today, the notion isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. 18 years after this atmospheric fleet line had been mooted, the Pneumatic Dispatch Company began carrying mail in a tunnel beneath Euston Station and their sorting office on Eversholt Street. And on occasion, a few brave souls even volunteered to take a ride in one of the claustrophobic little cars. Then, in 1864, a short experimental atmospheric railway, designed to carry passengers underground, was demonstrated in Crystal Palace Park. Whilst on the other side of the Atlantic, a similar short line, the Beach Pneumatic Transit System, was trialled in New York City, whisking people through a tunnel beneath Broadway between 1870 and 1873. Another of Charles Pearson's ideas, which he put forward in 1846, was to build a huge central station at Farringdon, which would have provided connections to London's other mainline railway terminals via a so-called arcade railway, which would have been laid in a broad tunnel at basement level. As well as helping to ease traffic, Charles speculated that such an underground railway would also be beneficial to the city's many working class residents, as it would enable them to live further out, rather than having to dwell in cramped slums within walking distance of their places of work. Although a model of the proposed Farringdon station was displayed at the Guildhall, Charles's subterranean suggestion sounded, well, a little bit wacky. This was the 1840s after all, and initially few people supported his vision. Nevertheless, this didn't deter the plucky solicitor, and he went on to form the City Terminus Company, with a view to raising funds to bring an underground railway for London to fruition. At around the same time, Another company was established, the North Metropolitan Railway Company, who, no doubt inspired by Charles Pearson's insistence on taking things below ground, were also toying with the idea of subterranean travel. The North Metropolitan Railway Company held their first meeting at 47 Parliament Street on the 31st of August 1853, where it was agreed they should seek to lay down 2 lines of railway in a continuous archway under the road. At another meeting held the following month, it was stipulated that the route would run from a first-class station opposite the Great Western Hotel at Paddington towards the proposed terminus in London's Financial Square Mile. Interestingly, it was also stated in the meeting that the line would be either cable-hauled or propelled by air pressure, although as we'll soon see, the more traditional method of steam would be the one ultimately employed. Along with these proposals, the North Metropolitan Railway Company said that, in the event Charles Pearson's City Terminus Company found itself unable to proceed, then they would step in to provide a similar route. And to cut a long story short, that's pretty much what happened, as the two notions eventually evolved into a plan to build an underground line, the Metropolitan Railway, beneath what was then the northern outskirts of central London. The main aim was to connect the major railway terminals, which were located along the edge of this perimeter, the reason they were cited here being that they'd been forbidden from encroaching upon the city centre, and as such the Metropolitan would run from Paddington to Farringdon, with stations at Euston and King's Cross. The idea was a bold one, and in typical British fashion, many people ridiculed it. The Times newspaper, for example, famously suggested in November 1861 that the scheme would never work, as a subterranean railway under London was awfully suggestive of dark, noisome tunnels buried many fathoms beyond the reach of light or life, passages inhabited by rats, soaked with sewer drippings, and poisoned by the escape of gas mains. In short, they said Londoners would probably prefer to take the bus, rather than be driven amid palpable darkness through the foul subsoil of London. The satirical magazine Punch, meanwhile, dubbed it the Sewer Railway, joking that Londoners might find engine drivers popping up in their cellars to borrow coal. Whilst Joseph Paxton, the architect behind the gleaming Crystal Palace Exhibition Centre, claimed simply that people would never go underground.
Mind the gap between a train and the platform.
Most alarming of all, though, were comments made by the Reverend Dr. John Cumming, who, with fire and brimstone, preached that such a railway was an aberration, a place where mortals weren't supposed to venture. The forthcoming end of the world will be hastened by the construction of the railways burrowing into infernal regions, and thereby disturbing the devil, he wrote in 1860. It's better to wait for the devil, he added, than to make roads down to hell. Despite the naysayers and the suggested risk of disturbing Beelzebub, Charles Pearson remained confident and teamed up with the Metropolitan Railway Company to give them his full backing, so much so that his support and influence was credited with raising much of the £1 million, about 100 million in today's money, which was required for the project. With the Metropolitan Railway's route now planned and granted permission, and the role of chief engineer being awarded to John Fowler, work on the line commenced at the beginning of January 1860, when the first shaft was sunk near Paddington Station. One report vaguely described the building site as being on the other side of Westbourne Terrace, a little behind the Great Western Hotel, which would seem to place it roughly where Craven Road now meets Praed Street. Just a few days later, a second shaft was started by another work gang on the eastern end of the route, this one being located beside King's Cross Station towards the southern end of York Road, and before long digging was also underway at St Pancras and Euston. By this point in London's history, the city had already seen one major tunnelling project, that being the pioneering Thames Tunnel, which had been bored beneath the river to connect Wapping and Rotherhithe. Masterminded by the genius engineer Mark Brunel, who was assisted by his son Isambard, the Thames Tunnel had opened to pedestrians back in 1843, and it remains in use today as part of the London Overground network. Although for those working on the Metropolitan Railway, the concept of burrowing beneath the busy streets of a major city was still in its infancy. The method developed for creating London's first underground line became known as the cut and cover technique, a relatively simple concept which involved the ground being turfed up and a large trench being excavated below. An arched brick wall was then built over the track bed, along with the addition of concrete and asphalt to aid waterproofing, and once this was complete, the land was shovelled back on top. The cut and cover method meant the tunnel was relatively shallow, which was handy as it enabled gaps for ventilation to be incorporated wherever possible. Remember, trains on the Metropolitan line were going to be steam hauled after all, and those big puffs of smoke were going to have to go somewhere. The most famous of these ventilation points, which was added as part of an extension towards Bayswater in the late 1860s, can be found sandwiched between Leinster Gardens and Porchester Terrace, where, on the Leinster Gardens side, the gap is hidden behind an elaborate facade at numbers 23 and 24. Yep, those two buildings in the middle, with the blocked out white windows, aren't real houses. They're merely false fronts, designed to blend in with the surrounding grand homes. This is how they appear on the other side. A little more bland, I think you'll agree. An evocative description of the cut and cover method appeared in an 1862 edition of the Manchester Guardian. The digging, they said, had to be made with almost as much care as a surgeon would perform an operation. There were the veins and arteries, which supply the great city with water, the tubes that supply it with gas, the slender cords, which, like nerves, transmit the electric fluid to all parts of the city. All of these had to be carefully and skillfully avoided. Although this makes the excavations sound neat and clinical, the reality was anything but. Constructing the cut and cover tunnels necessitated hideous disruption, and a lot of planners did their best to lessen the impact by taking the route beneath major roads, primarily New Road, the major thoroughfare now known as Marylebone Road and Euston Road. There were still many homes and businesses which were ruthlessly seized and demolished, especially towards the eastern end of the works, where a number of notoriously poor slums existed. In all, the process displaced around 12,000 people. This turmoil was perhaps best summed up by someone who, not long after the railway entered service, wrote a letter to the Times under the pseudonym An Inhabitant of Euston Square, which incidentally is once again occupied by a large building site thanks to the HS2 project. In no other country in Europe could inhabitants of a town, in a state of profound peace, be driven from their homes without even the power of legal appeal, this correspondent writes. But this is far from being all we have had to endure, he continues. For 3 years previously to the opening of this line, the residents of the district had to wade through sloughs of unpaved mud and clay to get in and out of their houses, whilst night and day the belch of steam engines and the lash of the carters' whips were the sounds mostly heard. Progress on the tunnel averaged 72 feet per week, although in trickier areas, where important buildings such as churches stood nearby, the pace slowed considerably, and at such sites, skilled miners were employed to conduct the more delicate excavations. For the 2,000 men forging the Metropolitan Railway's cut and cover tunnels, working conditions were tough and perilous. One of the first, and most bizarre accidents to occur on the project, occurred one evening in June 1860, when a mainline train crashed into the works area at King's Cross. The train in question had travelled down from Manchester, and as it approached the platform at King's Cross, witnesses noted that it wasn't slowing down. Instead, as a report in the Telegraph described, it dashed right through the station and leapt from the platform, carrying with it tender, brake and 1 or 2 carriages. It then proceeded to run beneath the clock tower and across the old St Pancras Road, smashing its funnel and steam cap against one of the iron girders of the archway it shot through, finally breaking into the enclosure of the nascent Metropolitan Railway works. Miraculously, no one was injured in this incident, although when the brakeman, James Warrington, was located, it was noted that his demeanour gave rise to the ugly presumption that he was intoxicated. Oh dear. Warrington had indeed had one too many, and charged with being drunk on duty, he admitted that he had taken 4 glasses of ale en route and that a gentleman at Peterborough had given him a glass of gin. For this atrocious conduct, the sozzled brakeman was given a 2-month prison sentence with hard labour. Later that year, and much more seriously, a construction engine, known as a steam navvy, exploded at the King's Cross construction site, killing 2 workers and seriously injuring another. The blast was so powerful that the engine's chimney was sent hurtling high into the air. It came plummeting down on York Road, where it struck a passing cabbie, who, as well as being no doubt incredibly surprised, also sustained injuries. Another fatal accident occurred at King's Cross when 28-year-old William Hollingworth, who had a young family, was crushed by a falling girder. In the summer of 1861, heavy rain caused a landslide near Judd Street at St Pancras, which dragged telegraph posts, gas and water pipes into the pit. This was followed by a more serious incident in which the River Fleet burst through the works at Ray Street, Clerkenwell. In those days, the submerged River Fleet was essentially one big sewer, and as one newspaper so delightfully noted, the roaring water it discharged was full of all manner of filth and offal. In a similar accident, a gang of workers were buried alive near Euston's Melton Street one night, and the landslip also resulted in the walls of nearby homes cracking, which, understandably, led to panic, with many residents running out into the street, wearing little more than their bedclothes. As if the working conditions weren't bad enough, the builders also had each other to contend with. In the 19th century, railway navvies had a reputation for being an incredibly tough breed of men. Although celebrated for their hard, back-breaking work, they were also known for their ferocious drinking, a culture which frequently resulted in punch-ups. In this regard, things got way too out of hand in June 1862, when at King's Cross, 2 men named James Driscoll and Edward Gregory got into a nasty argument. Unfortunately for them, this disagreement occurred high up on a set of girders, and after a few punches had been thrown, Driscoll was seen to grab Gregory and hurl him to the ground below, killing him instantly. The month before this murder, there had been a different, although equally dramatic incident near Farringdon, when a prisoner named William Gruby, who has been transported to the Clerkenwell House of Detention, succeeded in giving his jailers the slip. He managed to sprint as far as Acton Street, where he leapt into the Metropolitan Railway works and ran into a tunnel, where he was soon apprehended by a constable. By the early autumn of 1862, the Metropolitan Railway was pretty much complete. Test locomotives were running along the route, and it was anticipated that the world's first underground railway would open to the public in either September or October of that year. However, following an inspection by the government officer, Colonel Yolland, it was declared that the signalling wasn't up to scratch. Apparently the size and shape of said signals wasn't clear enough, meaning an overhaul was required. Because of this, coupled with the earlier burst of the River Fleet, the opening of the Metropolitan Railway was delayed by several months. So as you can see, such engineering delays are nothing new. Sadly though, this meant that Charles Pearson, the first man to envision an underground railway for London, never got to see the Metropolitan Railway in action. He passed away on the 14th of September 1862, just a few months before services commenced. As far as I know, Charles Pearson is not commemorated by any plaque, which in my personal opinion is something of a travesty. You can still see his tomb, however, which is located in West Norwood Cemetery, just outside the chapel, so if you're in the area, be sure to give him a nod. On that note, I'll draw this episode to a close. Please be sure to watch out for the next instalment though, in which we'll be looking at the early Metropolitan Railway itself, the stations, the rolling stock, and above all, just what was it like to ride on the world's first underground, all the way back in 1863. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this look at the birth of the Metropolitan Railway interesting. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Would you have opted for an atmospheric or cable-hauled railway rather than a steam-operated one? And do you think that Charles Pearson deserves a memorial? Please be sure to let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you so much to all of you who support my channel with your kind words, likes and shares. I couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus of course it would be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.